You've used your platform not to uplift, but to manipulate. You've become what you once stood against. The morning of the hearing began with rumors that a major political drama was about to unfold. The subject at the center of it all was none other than Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who had been quietly working behind the scenes for years but now found herself in the crosshairs of what many assumed was a major scandal. On the other end of the battlefield stood Representative Jasmine Crockett, a voice known for her sharp critique and fearless confrontations. Crockett, fueled by rage and suspicion, slapped Omar in front of court, accusing her of fraud and branding her a disgrace to her heritage. But as the truth unraveled, a wave of realization crashed over the courtroom, and Crockett was left stunned, silenced, and in tears by a single word spoken by Omar. As the courtroom filled with journalists, fellow lawmakers, legal analysts, and citizens, the air crackled with tension. Crockett stood tall, her expression a mixture of determination and fury. She had gone over the allegations countless times, transactions that seemed unusual, undocumented funds, connections to overseas donors. She had what she believed was a clear pattern of deceit, and she was ready to unmask it all in front of the nation. The cameras were rolling, the microphones were live, and the world was watching. She began by laying out what she called an irrefutable roadmap to deception. She pointed to financial records she claimed were doctored, shell organizations connected to Omar's name, and testimonies from anonymous sources who had seen too much. Her words were biting, carefully sharpened to inflict maximum reputational damage. You've used your platform not to uplift, but to manipulate. You've become what you once stood against, Crockett said, glaring at Omar with a sharpness that could cut stone. Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear but from a sense of burden she believed she was carrying. This wasn't just politics to her, it was a crusade. You are a disgrace to Africans, a disgrace to every immigrant who came here with honor. You've made a mockery of our institutions, she declared. The gasps in the room didn't faze her. She believed this was her moment to expose a great fraud, and she seized it with unrelenting fire. Omar sat quietly, hands folded, her face unreadable. She didn't interrupt or interject. She didn't roll her eyes or shake her head. She waited. The courtroom watched with bated breath. Then the judge turned to Omar and asked if she had a response. What came next was nothing like anyone expected, not a defensive outburst, not a political sermon, but a slow, steady unpacking of facts that changed the entire narrative. Omar began by acknowledging the seriousness of the accusations. She didn't mock them. She didn't treat them like partisan noise. I understand how this looks, she said, because on the surface, this country has often judged people like me before they knew the full truth. Then she reached into a folder and began distributing her own documents, copies of legislative audits, government reports, emails from ethics committees, and impact summaries of her programs. The courtroom fell into complete silence. Omar revealed that those funds Crockett had questioned were actually part of a multi-phase anti-fraud initiative aimed at exposing scam operations targeting poor and minority communities. The money trails were not evidence of theft, they were financial traps set to catch illegal actors in the act. Her shell organizations were undercover operations authorized by federal agencies, and her so-called anonymous sources? Disgruntled lobbyists who had lost millions when Omar shut down their exploitation schemes. Every document backed up her story. Every word was corroborated. She even read aloud from an internal Homeland Security email commending her for her covert cooperation in dismantling a massive tax fraud ring that had been bleeding underserved communities for years. Omar didn't just walk the walk, she had been doing the work while under relentless scrutiny and threats. They said I was a threat, she stated, but what they feared wasn't my background. It was that I was effective. As Omar spoke, the entire atmosphere in the room began to shift. Faces that had initially looked at her with suspicion began to soften. Even journalists who had sharpened their pens for a scandal started typing a different kind of headline. Crockett, meanwhile, stood frozen. Her breathing had changed. The confidence that had powered her opening statements had begun to crumble. The documents Omar submitted painted a completely different picture from the one she had presented. This wasn't a woman abusing power. This was someone leveraging her office to fight for the people most vulnerable to abuse. And she had been doing it with very little fanfare. Very little recognition. The reality was that the only fraud committed here was the one against her reputation. Then came the final moment. Omar said just one word. Truth. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. But it was heavy, like a final gavel of clarity slamming down on the confusion and chaos that had preceded it. That single word echoed in Crockett's mind like a siren. It stripped away her accusations. It dismantled the entire framework of assumptions she had built. And it forced her to confront something every politician fears, being wrong, publicly. devastatingly wrong. Crockett's eyes welled with tears. She looked down at the papers in her hands, the ones she had brandished so proudly earlier. They now felt like ashes, meaningless in the wake of Omar's proof. The fire inside her had turned to smoke, and with every breath she took, the weight of her misjudgment became heavier. The courtroom remained silent, not out of pity, but out of respect for Omar's restraint, for her strength, for her truth. When Crockett finally spoke again, her voice was no longer booming. It was human. "I owe you an apology," she began, "not just because I was wrong, but because I allowed my perception to be shaped by fear and suspicion rather than facts and context. I didn't do my due diligence. I failed you, and I failed the people I serve." Her words were painful, honest, and raw. There was no attempt to save face. There was only humility. She paused and added, "To think I almost destroyed the very person who's been saving Americans from being destroyed themselves. It hurts." Omar, ever composed, walked over to Crockett. There was no condescension in her eyes, only a firm sense of purpose. She extended her hand. Crockett took it, and in that handshake, an entire nation witnessed something rare in modern politics, a moment of true accountability, of dignity in defeat, of respect overcoming rivalry. It became a defining image that would go viral within hours, symbolizing not just a dramatic reversal, but the potential for unity beyond ideology. The fallout from the confrontation was massive. News channels across the spectrum picked up the story, and not one of them could spin it against Omar. Her record, her work, her truth, they were undeniable. Lawmakers who had doubted her started calling for greater support for her legislative agenda. Civic groups lauded her as a hero. She received thousands of letters and messages from Americans who thanked her for fighting battles they didn't even know they were losing. But the most surprising development came from Crockett herself. Rather than retreat in shame, she leaned into her mistake. She scheduled a follow-up press conference, not to repair her image, but to highlight the very issues Omar had championed. She committed to co-sponsoring new anti-fraud legislation with Omar, promising to use her platform to protect citizens from the same exploitative forces Omar had been battling. "We're not just here to clap back or point fingers," Crockett said at the press conference. "We're here to get results, and I want to work alongside someone who's been doing that, even when none of us were watching." Ilhan Omar stood beside her during that speech, saying little, smiling faintly. It was the kind of alliance born not of strategy, but of genuine growth. Their partnership was covered extensively, but more importantly, it inspired a new dialogue in Washington, one about humility, about admitting fault, about lifting each other up rather than tearing one another down for spectacle. This confrontation wasn't just a political episode, it became a cultural moment. It taught millions that sometimes, the people we misunderstand the most are the ones doing the most important work. That truth has its own rhythm, its own patience, and it always, eventually, emerges. Omar's grace under fire and Crockett's ability to own her mistake became a model for how public servants could evolve in real time. Their story was a reminder that leadership is not about never being wrong, but about how we respond when we are. So the next time we judge someone from a distance, the next time we think we know the whole story, let's remember this moment. Let's remember the slap that turned into a handshake. Let's remember the word, truth, that humbled a courtroom and changed a nation's perspective. And most of all, let's remember that even in the hardest of moments, there is room for clarity, compassion, and redemption. If this story moved you, challenged your assumptions, or gave you something to think about, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more powerful political stories like this one. Your support helps us continue to bring you narratives that matter. Truth deserves an audience. Thank you for being part of it.